Thank you for being here and welcome. This is, and I see people are already using the chat, and that's great. We encourage you, put your LinkedIn in, put your Twitter in, link to tweets if you want. Be active in the chat. I know people are actually getting to meet each other in the chat, and we'll also try and look at it for questions. But our hope is that you folks do get to know each other a bit through this. So we're going to spend a couple of hours. We're going to end at 2 o'clock Eastern, and we are hoping that we will get to know our three speakers, Laura, Eric, and Mac. And we will talk a bit about fundraising. We'll talk a bit about their backgrounds, their missions, because they are definitely very much all on a mission, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions. And I think we're also going to get and give some data. So speaker bios are on the Airtable. A link is being dropped. As always, we do closed caption. And we have another VentureCrush FG coming up on February 23rd, also from noon Eastern to 2 p.m. And before we get into fundraising type stuff, all three of our guests have some level of government involvement, and all three have definitely mission and purpose in their backgrounds. So I'd like to start in series a bit and get a little bit of background on them, and maybe we'll go alpha by first name. So Eric, we'll start with you. You played college basketball.
In my head, I did. I was really good too.
Were you a superstar athletically?
Yeah, of course. I live off of my immense physical gifts that I was born with.
But less interesting, you worked in tech in various companies that people actually like, amazingly widespread usage, like Hulu, where you were the founding CTO and were there for 6 years. You were the CTO of another company a little more recently, between your time being a partner at Kleiner Perkins and your time being a partner at Kleiner Perkins.
That's right.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I after Hulu, which was such a fun ride, I joined Kleiner in 2010 and spent 9 years there, but in a variety of different roles, one of which was actually to not be in the office day to day. Right in the middle of that stint, I went and joined one of our portfolio companies, Flipboard, to go run engineering for them for about 1.5 years, which was a really great experience. It was fun to invest in the company, attend board meetings, and then go work for the CEO. And then after all it was done, went back to Kleiner between 2015 and 2019 and ran the early stage consumer investment practice there.
And during starting in the last century, because you're an old school tech person, you also were a developer at Trilogy and then worked at Microsoft, and you have founded companies in the US and outside the US, right?
That's right. Yeah, I'm always an aspiring entrepreneur. Often I don't have the courage or the conviction to go off and do it, but I think at every stop of the way, that's always a dream, to go back and start companies. I think I always say there's nothing more emotionally rewarding than starting a company. I find investing to be incredibly intellectually rewarding, but in terms of emotionally rewarding, there's just nothing like being an entrepreneur.
And your companies, where outside the US have you started companies?
So I lived in China for 3 years, from 2004 to 2007. I was doing research at Microsoft, research in the Beijing lab, primarily in AI, computer vision, and graphics. And when I was out there, I had the bug to start a company, and that's what actually brought me back to the States. Hulu acquired the company that I'd started in China. So I've had some fun building companies and products and teams in China. And the China that I grew up, that I didn't grow up, but the China that I worked in and lived in is very different than the China of today. It was friendlier, less scary, and I think much more open and welcoming of collaboration with the US.
And you then started your last company, or maybe I shouldn't say your last company, but you started Packaged. It was acquired by Facebook. You became a senior exec at Facebook and
You a
handled a
counsel
couple of
too?
initiatives.
Thank you for that, Ed.
Yeah. Thank you.
Little plug for Lowenstein.
And handled a couple of initiatives at Facebook. And what are you doing now that you've left Facebook?
Yeah, so I had another company in 2019. This was a little strange in that it was a company that I invested in. I was like a part-time entrepreneur. I don't give myself credit for being the full-time entrepreneur because I was still at Kleiner most of the time during the week, but was certainly a part-time entrepreneur of the company. And when Facebook acquired it, one of the conditions was that I joined full-time, which I was excited to do. So left Kleiner, joined Facebook in 2019 as part of this acquisition, and I was there leading up commerce incubation, so coming up with new shopping transactional business features for Facebook. And then I left in the second half of last year, so about 6 months ago, to pursue two things. One is I really wanted to get more involved in the API community, so the Asian Pacific Islander community. I felt had gone through a lot over the last 24 months with Stop Asian Hate, with on the extreme negative, but on the extreme positive, a lot of representation in Hollywood and media with the first ever, culminating last year with the first ever Asian superhero. I can't even tell you, I never dreamed of that day. Never. Growing up as like the only Chinese kid in my school in Texas, like I never saw myself anywhere represented in the media, and to be able to have that moment happen in my lifetime was just unbelievable. So things like that really got me inspired to get more involved. So I've started a fund called Gold House Ventures that's dedicated to advancing and supporting Asians and Pacific Islanders in this country. And we have a fund that invests in Asian entrepreneurs. So that's a big part of what I've been spending my time in. And the second is working on a new co, which again, Lowenstein is counsel for. So I should mention Lowenstein's counsel for the fund as well. So sort of can't get away from Ed and his partners as much as I try.
So I appreciate the shameful plugs, completely unnecessary, and love my Lowenstein team, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But Gold House Ventures, so you're investing in API founders, and how much of the LP base so far is API related?
Great question. So out of our 65 LPs so far, we have over 60 of them that are of API background. So lots of very prominent entrepreneurs and investors in the community, but luckily we have supporters from different ethnicities and cultures as well. But we've really targeted trying to rally the API community first. In fact, we kind of view the LP list as almost a networking opportunity, which is a neat way to spin it. In that it's almost like a club that we want to invite people in with the LP membership, and use that as just a networking vehicle for us all to get together around this cause. So we have skewed very, very heavily towards API LPs as well.
Great, and I love what you're doing. Should companies of all stages look at Gold House as a potential funding source?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think the fund is it's a small fund, so we're not going to lead any growth rounds, but we want to be involved in every prominent Asian success out there to really promote representation, and that's the key for us. It's not about subsidizing companies that aren't going to do well. It's about being a part of the journey of the great successes for our community, so that we can lift them up and shine a bright light on them to inspire more entrepreneurs to follow in those footsteps. It's the whole mission of our fund is really around shining this light on on what our community can go do. So that involves companies at the early stage, but a lot of companies at the late stage too. And especially for this first one, we're going to be playing a lot more catch up. I think in subsequent funds, if we can earn our right to go and raise them, it will skew far more early stage because if the model is working, we will be introduced to entrepreneurs at earlier stages. But right now, there are a lot of great Asian-led companies that have gotten to massive scale, and we still want to be a part of them to really further this mission of shining a light on examples of great success.
That's awesome. Love what you're doing. And I want to now have Laura introduce herself a little bit, but I'm going to start by talking about this dinner that, so in between spikes of COVID, we did a couple of in-person things outdoors in New York. They were not for the faint of heart because it was freezing cold, and the people who had come from California or from Tennessee were complaining bitterly about New York and it's cold. And if you can't take the cold, get out of the kitchen. But we had this kind of moving experience at dinner where a woman who runs her venture fund that we had invested in, when she realized who Laura was and that she was sitting at the table with Laura, kind of became very emotional because she got her start in tech through Code 2040, and Laura is kind of a superhero. So Laura, do you want to maybe, you can start wherever you'd like, but I'd love to hear a little bit about 2011 with you and Tristan and how things started there.
Sure, thank you. That was a great dinner in that brief window where we all felt like maybe we could inch back to normal. So I think actually the sort of point in my journey that I usually come back to and start in is when I decided to go to grad school. I had done a bunch of stuff in the nonprofit sector and kind of wanted to go to grad school to learn some things to take back to the impact space. And I chose to go to Stanford, where I got my JD MBA, mostly because it was 3,000 miles from anywhere else I'd ever lived or spent time. And it seemed like it would be fun to go to California for a little while. And I had heard the term Silicon Valley, but I didn't really know what it meant. And I landed in Palo Alto in August of 2007. And the iPhone had come out 6 weeks before. And this was basically like the dawn of the mobile web as we know it. And I had unwittingly found myself kind of in the center of it. And my entire network up to that moment was East Coast based. And when I would talk to my friends back home, it was like I was speaking another language. They had no idea what I was talking about when I was saying, software is going to eat the world and all of this at that time. And so I felt like I had sort of stumbled into this bit of privilege of being kind of surrounded by and immersed in this new to me way of sort of thinking and seeing the world. And so when I was offered a role at an early stage consumer web startup, I took it because I felt like how could I say no to the chance to kind of learn more about this space. And I was at the startup for a couple of years. And as I was thinking about moving on, I had a conversation with a business school classmate of mine, Tristan Walker, who many of you may know or know of. He was running biz dev at Foursquare at the time. And we had a conversation. And actually, it's funny, Ed unearthed this story that I had told on the internet, which I rewatched earlier. It's like, oh yeah, that was a good story. But it was essentially when I met up with Tristan over the summer in 2011, and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. And we were in this conference room at the Foursquare office, and Tristan picked up this whiteboard marker and sort of rolled his conference room chair over to the whiteboard and wrote the number 2040 on the whiteboard, and pointed at it. And he said, "This is the start of the decade when people of color will be the majority in the US." And if we look around where we are now, this is 2011 in Silicon Valley, we're just not seeing representation of the folks who are going to be the new majority in these conference rooms and in these conversations. And that led us to start Code 2040, which is a nonprofit organization that is essentially designed to close the gap for underrepresented communities in tech. It is now a massive community dedicated to racial equity in tech. When we started, it was really centered around building a fellows program. The narrative at the time, for folks who are around and remember, was that the reason that tech was so homogenous was because there just weren't talented people of color out there. There weren't talented women out there. If they were out there, we'd hire them. Tech's a meritocracy, but they're not out there, so woe is us. What could we do? And with Code 2040, we set out to disprove that narrative and to build bridges between the talent that we knew was out there and the folks who wouldn't find that talent. And so we started with an internship program for Black and Latinx computer science students. We started with a 5-student pilot and grew it from there. But also through doing that work and eventually placing hundreds of students across hundreds of tech companies, we recognized that it wasn't just about disconnected networks, but also about the systems and processes and policies that were in place that made it very difficult for companies to attract, hire, retain folks from underrepresented backgrounds, and that there was actually systemic work, not just around building connections, but also around sort of undoing existing policies and processes and building up equitable ones sort of from the ground up. So we did a lot of that work with Code 2042. And it was right around then that I got a call from Megan Smith, who was the US Chief Technology Officer in the Obama administration at the time. And she asked me to join her. Well, actually, I will tell this story because this is one of my favorite examples of allyship that I really like to highlight. So Megan had been invited to speak, to be part of a keynote at South by Southwest. For folks who remember South by Southwest pre-pandemic, obviously like giant gathering of folks in Austin. Basically all of Silicon Valley goes to Austin, and then folks from a bunch of other places, and that's sort of where tech is for a week in March. And there's a number of ways to speak there. You sort of submit, but the keynote spots are pretty coveted. That's where you're in front of sort of thousands of folks, as opposed to in like a side room at the convention center. And 2 women had run a study about gender in Silicon Valley, and they asked Megan to join them for a keynote on stage. And she said, if we're going to have a conversation about gender in the Valley, we need to have, it can't just be white women. It was 2 white women and she's a white woman. And she said, I'll only join you on stage if we bring a woman of color as well. And she reached out to me and asked if I would join to have this conversation. And so I said yes. And we had this great talk on stage. And then when we got off stage, she said, okay, the real reason I invited you here is I'd love for you to come join me at the White House and bring your sort of practitioner lens to the policy space for like the last run of the administration. And it was maybe sort of hard to imagine from the outside, but a extremely difficult decision because I was CEO of this fast growing and fragile, it seemed, because it was early on, a nonprofit. But I felt like I couldn't pass up the opportunity. So I went to the Obama administration, the last 6 months of the administration, and did work with Megan on DEI and equitable access to capital. I finished out my time at Code 2040 and have then worked sort of around the venture space for a couple of years. I was entrepreneur in residence at New Media Ventures, which is a nonprofit venture firm. They invest in nonprofit and for-profit startups, working to tackle the greatest challenges to American democracy. And then I was head of impact at an early stage social innovation fund called Echoing Green, which invests also a nonprofit that invests in nonprofits and for-profits globally, entrepreneurs operating at the intersection of innovation and justice. And then just under 6 months ago, I hopped over to Base 10 as a partner, leading operations for our growth funds called the Advancement Initiative, which is designed to close the endowment gap for historically Black colleges and universities who have just a really embarrassingly low amount of capital compared to their comparable predominantly white institutions. And I will just give one stat there and then I will stop talking, which is that there are over 100 HBCUs in the US collectively. If you combine all their endowments, they are under $3 billion. Last year, Harvard added $11 billion to their endowment. So they just have they have 1/30th the size, the amount of money per student that a comparable predominantly white institution has. And they're driving really economic mobility for a large part of the Black community without the resources that they need to do so effectively. And so Base 10 is sort of leaning into our strength as investors to actually redirect capital to HBCUs. I will stop there because I've talked a lot.
It's amazing. And I want to pause here to just note, I did spend time this weekend and last weekend listening to podcast interviews with Laura and YouTube videos. And every single one of them was very worthwhile. And they are full of stats and really insightful takes on how to turn those stats into actionable items. And on the HBCU front, so as a trustee at a top 10 HBCU, which is Fisk University in Nashville, I've been a trustee at a top STEM school, Harvey Mudd, which is part of the Claremont Colleges in Southern California. The schools are the same size. Fisk is about 100 years older than Harvey Mudd. Harvey Mudd feels endowment constrained. It is about 15x the size of the Fisk endowment. And again, it is a top 10 HBCU. And I think what the Advancement Initiative is doing is amazing, which is why we are investors in that fund and in Base 10. And it's a really important conversation. And because you mentioned Megan Smith, who's terrific, doing that call out in public on stage, I am going to mention that after this session, I want to make sure that you get connected to Adanma, who I believe is with us today. And she and I and Josh Koppelman, Adanma Raymond, have been working on something that we're not going to talk about here, but that I want you to be connected with. It's been going on for a while. Other people are involved. So hopefully you and Adanma can talk and maybe I can join that conversation as well. So much more to come on that, and also on the omission of not just HBCUs and institutions other than PWIs participating in the huge run up in venture capital. We're going to talk about some of the structural things. And that leads us nicely to Mac. So Mac, do you want to give us a bit of your a bit of what you're up to today with Rare Breed, and then we'll backtrack a little bit.
Yeah, so at Rare Breed, so in 2020, September 2020, I left my job working for what is essentially the investment arm of the state of Maryland to start Rare Breed Ventures, a $10 million pre-seed to seed venture fund, essentially investing in companies outside the major tech hubs, outside of Silicon Valley, New York, and Massachusetts. That is the quick and dirty version.
And you got your start in venture kind of thanks to the NRA, an organization that I detest and have been raising money against for many, many years. So you want to tell us how the NRA kind of put you in business?
Yes, this is a true story. So quick background before we get to the NRA. I did matriculate at HBCU, Morgan State University, which I'm proudly representing. Then went on to be a government contractor with the top secret clearance. So like I did what every self-respecting Black kid out of Baltimore would do is I dropped out of college my junior year and got a job at the NSA. Yes, that's how that worked. Then went on to be a two-time founder. One was successful, one failed. And then after having a failing company, I just wanted to get a job, like just get a regular paycheck because like having a failed company sucks. And so I get a job at this marketing firm. It's in the heart of Baltimore City, is right by the harbor, beautiful place. They hired me to be the head of internal products. So I figured I'd be an entrepreneur, build cool stuff, get a steady paycheck, security. Yes, thank you. But then I ended up running a team of junior front-end developers building e-commerce websites, which was not what I had planned for myself, but they were easy money. I was having fun, whatever. And then after being there for a year, the week Philando Castile got shot and killed in his car by a police officer for legally carrying a firearm was the same week that organization started soliciting the National Rifle Association for a contract. And as many people will know, the National Rifle Association has a history of not supporting Black gun owners. And so I kept telling everybody around me, like, if we win this contract, I'm going to quit, right? Everybody thought I was joking because I clearly had no plan. Like I was just like, this is just what I'm going to do. And 2 weeks later, they did the, salesy thing and rang the gong and everybody celebrated because we won the contract. And I immediately printed out my 2-week notice and took it right up to the CEO and told him I was quitting and that I could no longer work there as that organization as a Black man. That was on a Friday. Had no clue what I was going to do, had no plans, had no direction, just knew I couldn't work there anymore. The very next Monday, the investment arm of the state of Maryland put out an email, a call out to the community saying they were hiring a new fund manager. And so again, I did what every self-respecting Black kid from Baltimore. I was arrogant enough to believe without a college degree or finance background, I could get a job working for this investment organization for the state. Had no clue how prestigious it was or how many people were going up for it. I just knew that I knew startups and that this was something I figured I could do. And so 4.5 months later, they told me I was not qualified for that position, but that they were creating a junior position to bring me on staff. And that's how I got started in venture. I applied off of the email.
Love it. And when you said background in finance, is that really a prerequisite for being a VC?
I don't think so. I feel like I'm a very good VC, like I've done pretty well. So I don't think it's a prerequisite, but that's the thing you hear, have an iBanking background, a finance background, have been an uber successful entrepreneur, be an angel investor, like all those things. Like I am none of that.
Eric, when you were hired by Kleiner Perkins, did they look at your undergraduate degree, which is not in finance or economics?
That I know of, no. I find that investors do very little finance work. I remember when we started our growth fund at Kleiner, I was there right when we started it and brought over Mary Meeker, who's brilliant, from Morgan Stanley to come run it. And she comes in and I was on loan because we didn't even have a growth team fully hired out yet. So I was on loan to Mary, working on our very first growth investment, which was Twitter. And we were going through diligence and she said, okay, great. Let's build a DCF. And kind of looked around the room to my venture partners that were on loan. And we were like, I don't think any of us can build a DCF. So we had to go Google like building a DCF and what goes into it and what are the inputs. And it's because, you know, as venture investors, like we just weren't that skilled in finance. So to say that it's a prerequisite, I think is, I totally agree with Mac. That seems ludicrous.
Yeah, and for those who don't know what DCF stands for, you're not missing that much: discounted cash flow. And in venture at that time, particularly ironic that it was Twitter, because the cash wasn't actually flowing. There was, you invested, didn't you invest before they had a monetization strategy?
We did. Oh, it was flowing. It was just flowing out of the company. Yeah, there was no cash coming in. It was just,
the wrong way.
It was going out. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And Mac, and this goes back to the thread with Laura. You've talked about using an innovative legal mechanism to do the to do your fundraise. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
So for those who don't know, I basically raised my fund off of Twitter. So 80% of my LPs came from interaction or connection I made on Twitter, which is very unique, I guess.
There's Eric's DCF.
Yes, there we go. So basically, thanks to the Jobs Act, there was a new back then designation that anybody fundraising could use, whether a fund or a startup, which is the 506C designation, which basically means you're allowed to publicly solicit, but all of your investors must be accredited investors. Traditionally, you use the 506B designation, which means you can fundraise, but you're not allowed to publicly solicit, but up to 30 of your investors can be unaccredited, right? So those are the major distinctions. And so as I was thinking about
sorry,
raising,
I just want to interrupt for 1 second. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The Jobs Act, because the Jobs Act made it easier to raise capital, therefore creating jobs, therefore creating more funding for startups. That must have been a Republican-led initiative, right?
I don't believe so.
Oh, I'm sorry. It was 2012. It was an Obama thing.
Yeah.
Okay, never mind. Yeah, no, my bad. It was an Obama job creation, capital formation incentive. Sorry, go ahead. Back to you. I apologize.
So
I get stuff wrong a lot.
So yeah, so the big thing for me was when I decided to raise my fund, I didn't, like most people raise a fund, you need like 50 to 100K to go make it happen. I had $2,500 in my bank account when I decided to raise this fund. And so thanks to this, my growing Twitter community and also, you know, COVID, so being able to have all my meetings on Zoom, I soft circled my, what I did was I started growing my Twitter community and I realized other VCs were following me. And so I decided if you were a VC and followed me, I would send you a DM for a meeting because I needed to learn how to raise a fund. And then I met Elizabeth Yin from Hustle Fund, one of like my first like 50 meetings, to say, hey, what you're doing sounds really interesting and really cool. What's your minimum? At the time, my minimum's 10K. She's like, I could do that. Blew my mind. Didn't know GPs could invest in funds. So that became my strategy. So from the middle of June 2020 to the middle of September 2020, I had over 1,100 meetings. The exact number on my calendar is 1,128 meetings, not including phone calls and anything else. And that's how I soft circled my first 2 million. And that was all thanks to Twitter. And today I have a $10 million fund. Yeah.
Amazing. And by the way, I saw that June Angelides is here, and June started a coding school for mums in the UK, and has been recognized and, I don't know, basically knighted. So she's kind of royalty. So it's kind of cool that June is here, and she's worth following as well. Laura, you just were, and I hope that you have ADHD like I do, because that's what enables me to answer some of these questions while listening to like all of you speak. You were messaging with our friend Denmark, who is one of the founders of Culture Shifting Weekend, and you were talking about having told this story at Culture Shifting Weekend. There's another story you told at Culture Shifting Weekend, and that story goes to a relationship that formed because one of the early supporters of Code 2040 was Google, and Google supported in two ways. One, they released data in 2014 that changed the way we were talking about diversity. And so data transparency has a real role here. And then there was someone that you met at a culture shifting weekend who worked at Google, and maybe you could talk a little bit about that. And I also want to applaud Denmark, who's been a VC and entrepreneur in New York and LA for years, and an amazing person, and is a co-founder of Culture Shifting Weekend, which is also a place where I have met a number of folks that I've invested in over the years. So I have tremendous respect for what Denmark and Andrea and others are doing with Culture Shifting Weekend.
Yeah, so I'll start with the data transparency piece because it really, there have been over the past, I don't know, I guess it's certainly 10 plus years that I've been working on diversity, inclusion, equity in the tech space. There have been a couple major wind shifts that have had a huge impact on my and others' ability to do the work. So I mentioned when I was talking before about sort of the prevailing climate in 2011 when we started talking about the idea for Code 2040. And the sort of great skepticism that we encountered at the time. And between 2011 and 2012, a handful of the organizations that sort of became, I was going to say household names, but household names, if you are nerding out in the diversity and tech space, one of the very few households that is doing that. Sort of Code 2040, Black Girls Code, Girls Who Code, all started in that sort of 12-month window. And a bunch of the kind of first coding boot camps and sort of alternative education spaces like General Assembly and like that sort of all were starting right around then. But it was very much this, trying to explain to people not just what Code 2040 was, but why we needed to exist, and combating a lot of myths about what the tech workforce did look like, should look like, who was available to participate, who wasn't. And in 2014, Google released their diversity data after a big push and a lot of behind the scenes work with Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Push Coalition. And when they released their data and it became clear that the problem was not in anybody's head, but was actually out there in the real world, reflected by these numbers. And the fact that Google was the first to say it, Google, which particularly at the time was held up as like not only a company to admire, but a workplace to admire, like the Google as the best place to work, released this data that showed how skewed their workforce was, and it completely transformed the conversation. A lot of companies followed suit. They felt either that they could or that they had to after Google did. And it just totally changed the nature of doing the work, as opposed to walking into rooms and having to sort of explain the premise of the problem. And yes, there really is a problem. And yes, it really is important. There just was like a foundation for that. And it went from, like swimming upstream to whitewater rafting. Like suddenly all the momentum was like towards diversity in tech. And we had way more companies interested, and fundraising got easier. Everything gained momentum at that point. And just to sort of complete that thought before I go back to the Google, the other piece of the Google story, that about faced abruptly in 2016, 2017, when Trump took office. It basically under the sort of halo of the Obama administration of folks feeling like, well, we want to, my theory about this actually has a lot to do with regulation and how much tech companies want to fly under the radar and sort of be just considered good actors by federal government in particular to avoid regulation. That is like a separate, probably a separate conversation, but you were sort of informally rewarded for being like a good tech company that cared about diversity and cared about community in the Obama administration. And then as the climate shifted and different sets of priorities and actions were suddenly elevated and rewarded, companies, even the companies who were interested in doing the right thing, did not want to talk about it. Like they did not want any PR associated with it. And then those companies who were in it for the PR and the storytelling were like, oh, great, we don't have to do this anymore, like peace. And so the climate shifted dramatically again, sort of 2 to 3 years later. But the culture shifting weekend, so I mean, this is one of the things that I am most looking forward to getting back to, is these in-person convenings where you get a chance to have these sort of quasi-orchestrated, quasi-serendipitous encounters with folks where the like extreme deliberateness of setting up meetings kind of doesn't always get you there, or requires over 1,000 meetings to get what you need. But I was at culture shifting weekends, and every Code 2040, a number of different Google conversations and relationships, and every single one of those essentially rolled up to like someone reported to someone who reported to someone who reported to David Drummond. And David Drummond was at this this culture shifting weekend, and I had never been able to like get in touch with him, get a meeting on the calendar, but here he was, and we were in the same room. And so I sort of worked up the courage and went over and introduced myself. And he, it turned out, had heard of Code 2040 and knew who we were and what we were doing, and was excited actually to get to meet me. And he ended up coming to the Code 2040 offices, and we had this like extensive discussion of kind of going deep on what we were doing and why, and all the different places where that sort of touched the different Google priorities. And it ended up sort of cementing a partnership with them, which then was able to weather the transition from Google to Alphabet, where a lot of stuff was sort of in flux and in churn, because we had this extremely senior executive who was kind of bought into the Code 2040 partnership. We were able to weather that. There's then another story about how our partnership with Google dissolved later, but that's we can save that for the sequel.
Okay, and I mean, there are a number of takeaways. One is that Drummond put himself in that room, and he put himself in that room as an act of intentionality. And then he said to you, come visit the office. I want to come visit the office. And you were like, oh, maybe he says that to all the, people he meets, but he actually followed up, and you followed up. And a year later, there was a real result, and you don't know how important the event was. You don't know how good the meeting was until a year or 5 or 10 years later. Being there in person matters, but Mac, part of how you were able to raise the fund was the cost reduction and time reduction inherent in virtualizing all of your pitch meetings. So how are you thinking about raising money and sourcing deals as an investor once we're much less virtualized again?
I guess I'm gonna have to do it the old school way and like get on a plane and go meet people and shake people's hands and look them in the eye before they write me a check. Which is funny because like as we were sitting here, I literally got a note about getting like a $500,000 check put in our account from an LP who I've never met in person and have only had a 30-minute conversation with, right? Thank you, Twitter, and thank you to Jason Calacanis and This Week in Startups podcast. That was awesome. Those things happen. I don't know, right? So it's interesting for me for a first time fund. It was a $10 million fund. I have over 200 LPs. You know, finding those individuals who can write a 10K to 50K check. Twitter's great for that. My fund two, we're going out the market to raise 75 million. Maybe oversubscribed to higher. I don't know if I can do that on Twitter. But for me, what I have, you know, will I be able to have first meetings with LPs on Zoom? Hopefully, right? Hopefully you're not going to fly me out to Chicago just to spend a couple days and tell me no. Like, hopefully you'll have the first meeting with me on Zoom, and then you'll fly me out to Chicago and tell me no, right? Like, I'll go with that. But more importantly, I think I'm trying to build a playbook so other people can, right? I want to show people that there's more than one way to raise money. There's more than one way to structure your fund. So like most funds, you have to raise or soft circle a certain amount of money, close on that and do a first close and then go raise the rest. I did rolling closes every 3 weeks. So as LPs committed, I closed right away, which allowed me to then start deploying capital faster, start to build up my portfolio, build up the track record, all the good stuff. Everybody, you know, people would be like, well, why would you do that? I don't know. It's just like, I didn't have any money. I needed money so I could start investing. So it was a necessity, right? So like everything I did for my fund one was out of necessity, and I broke every rule, right? But it worked, which just tells me that all these rules that we have in place don't really matter. No, it's just what people have been doing for forever. But if people truly believe in your strategy, or maybe not in your strategy, if people truly believe in you, they're able to get out of their own way, right? Another unique thing about my fund one is we have 12 institutions in our fund one. You rarely see institutions in a fund one, especially a $10 million fund, because most institutions can't write a check that small. Well, I learned this other thing out. You know how as investors, sometimes we make exceptions for like exceptional founders and people we really like, and we'll do a check smaller or do a check bigger. Apparently LPs do the same thing. You know, they will make exceptions. They tell you all the things they do and don't do. But if they like your strategy enough, or they like you enough, or if you build up enough of a brand, they'll make an exception. And so what Twitter's really done is help me build a brand. It's helped me build name recognition, which now when I get in the rooms, people are excited to hear what I'm about. So now they're not trying to, I don't come into the room with them thinking like, okay, who is this fund manager? What's his strategy? Oh yeah, he's another one of these pre-seed funds. You're gonna do a bunch of 100K checks. I've seen a million of those. They're now like, oh, this is Mac. He has a viewpoint. He is a person. I'm excited to hear more about his viewpoint, right? So that's probably the biggest advantage I've gotten building that Twitter presence, is having a brand that allows me to punch above my weight. But when I go to raise fund two, who knows? We'll see if it's still as valuable or not. But I will say this, right? I have limited to 99 LPs if I want to raise that much money, right? I'm still going to have somewhere between 30 to 40 spots for small check LPs, right? Democratizing access is what I care about, is what matters. You know, there's a few families in my fund, Black families, who have their own, like, are starting a small family office, who have never allocated money in this asset class, right? It can't be there in my fund one and then they never see this again, right? So, you know, I'm excited to give folks like that opportunities to continue to invest in me and invest with me. And hopefully we'll see companies like Allocate, who, full disclosure, we're an investor in, you know, creating more and more access for folks like them. So we'll see.
So Laura and Eric, feel free to jump in here, but you have touched a nerve. And there are a couple of things that I want to talk about here. And one of them is that the accredited investor standard and the way we use the accredited investor standard, even in the democratized version of the exemption that Mac proceeded under, incorporates the same systemic racism that the Voting Rights Act that LBJ passed was supposed to eliminate. And I realize that as a lawyer who does venture capital and who represents clients in selling securities, it is a strange thing for me to say. But Mac, you had to do a lot of paperwork or get a lot of paperwork to prove that those investors were accredited. And I see Eric is shaking his head. When you use this exemption, you are required to do more to ensure that all of these investors are accredited, right?
Absolutely. So one of the things about using the 506C designation is you have to do an extra level of, verification to show that these individuals are accredited investors. So, which just means it's an extra bill. Like it's one more service I have to pay for, one more bill I have to pay as I fundraise my $10 million fund, which management fees aren't astronomical. So, and granted, like for most funds, when you're building your fund, one, you can reimburse yourself for the money you spend to spin up the fund. But two, a lot of people have in their LPAs or their limited partnership agreements where they can use money in the fund to cover some of those operational costs. I don't have that. I don't have that in my LPA for a very specific reason, because I want more money to invest with. Because as I take money out of the fund, that means I have less money to invest with, right? So if you think about just the economics of it, it's a $10 million fund. 2% is going to go to me for management fees over 10 years. So that's 2% a year over 10 years is 20%, which makes 2 million come off the top already. So that means I got 8 million to invest in, right? Well, when I make investments and people talk about my IRR or my MOIC or my TVPI, I'm going to be benchmarked on that 10 million mark, not the 8 million I'm actually investing with. But now if you're taking some of that money off the top to cover operational costs, let's say your fund administration, legal, maybe some accounting, that's another 100 to 150 a year. Take that out 10 years, that's 1.5 million, right? So that means 3.5 million is already taken off the top before I even start investing. That means I only have 6.5 million to invest in, but I got to hit multiples over 10. I'll just take that out of my management fees. I'll give myself a smaller salary so I have more money to invest in and get more bites at the apple to give myself a better chance of returning my LPs their money, right? That's the way I thought about it. And this is the part where Ed gets frozen.
That's like a mic dropping moment, I think.
You scared him out of the Zoom, man. You dropped so much
I'm back.
knowledge on him.
I promise I'm here. I'm back. Sorry. And so Laura, you have talked a lot about the wealth gap and the implications of the wealth gap, and this is going to tie right back in. And I know that you've shared numbers. I have some numbers which I'm happy to share as well, but I don't know if you have numbers. You seem to have so much data off the top of your head that I don't want to miss the opportunity. Okay.
No, I mean, you may have more up-to-date numbers than I do, but I do think data points are critical for having these types of conversations because it ensures that you cannot be dismissed, which a lot of people would like to dismiss these things that are quite uncomfortable. But I think what you're referring to is the stats around the wealth gap in the U.S., where the median white family has about 10 times the amount of net worth than a Black family or a Latinx family. And these, I gave a talk a couple weeks ago where I was sort of trying to draw out for folks the importance of understanding like these asset classes and the need to invest and to own for folks when it comes to building generational wealth, because a lot of the narrative is really around income and the need to sort of get a good job and have a steady salary. And the what is transformational is actually ownership. And a lot of this used to be around home ownership. We're seeing various types of ownership evolving and emerging now. There's an entire conversation happening around like Web3 and the types of ownership that we're seeing emerging now, and which communities are being included and excluded, and the way that that is going to reverberate over the coming decades, because these cycles can be ported over into new asset classes and new technologies if we are not so conscious and deliberate about trying to break them. So I don't know what point you were hoping I would make, Ed. I feel like I just started rambling about asset
No,
classes,
this is great. So I'm gonna share some data. And you said, by the way, the average or median worth of a Black family, and I'm just gonna say that as a lawyer, I focus on the words. I know you have actually a whole bunch of degrees.
correct me. You're looking at stats and I'm pulling from my memory.
I always use either wealth or financial worth, because our history and people who look like me have a history of actually putting a goddamn price tag on human beings. And so I think it's important to confront our history. So the median income for Black households is $44,000 as of 2019. That's income. And the median financial wealth, and this is the wealth gap for Black families, is 23,000, contrasted with 184,000 for white families and 38,000 for Hispanic families. And I'm quoting and using the verbiage from the St. Louis Fed, which published data. And white families, 15% of families of households who are millionaires, white families 15%, Black families 2%. Why is this important? And by the way, this is about fundraising. Make no mistake, this is about how you fundraise. It's about from whom you fundraise, and it's about how you think about investing in folks when they put together a friends and family round. I'm going to give this again. 15% of white families are millionaires. 2% of Black families are millionaires. So now let's go to accredited investors. And by the way, it turns out, and the Fed also produces this data, that college is not an equalizer on this front. It doesn't matter. If you have comparable education, the dollar levels are higher across the categories, but the disparity remains, which is extraordinary. So the accredited investor standard is $200,000 a year of annual income, or together with spouse 300, or $1 million of net financial worth, excluding the home that Laura spoke about. Okay, so immediately, because we are on notice of an existing wealth gap, we immediately have a problem where the government, by imposing the accredited investor standard, is saying you should disproportionately give wealth creation opportunities to white people, because that's the way it's going to work as a matter of math based on the data, right? To Laura's point, you have to have the data. And in the context of 506C, which was intended to democratize, but there were changes and clarifications in 506C, making it more stringent so that you have to do more to validate the wealth of the people from whom you're accepting checks. One of the things the SEC said you should do is obtain a written confirmation from one of the following persons of your wealth: a registered broker-dealer, an investment, or a CPA. Or you can give your actual tax returns. You can show deep, detailed financial data. So in a country where we have a wealth gap, how many Black families have a lawyer who is going to say, yes, I vouch that this person has $1 million, and I'm using the word vouch specifically, I vouch that this person has over $1 million. How many have a lawyer who was willing to say, yes, I vouch that this person makes 300,000 a year with spouse. Yes, I vouch for the financial value of this family. You're asking them to enter a system. And again, the system of lawyers and wealth managers is predominantly white. We're working to change that, but it is. So systemically, we have a problem that needs to be redesigned, and vouching is a big part of it under the exemption that Mac was talking about. And Mac, did you see this kind of vouching when you were looking at the forms, or were you fortunate enough to not have to get the forms from people where they were asking their wealth managers, et cetera?
I mean, I used a third-party system to do essentially additional KYC, which I paid for each individual LP on top of the KYC, which Carter handled for me. So, yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to read you one thing on vouching, and then we can move on, or if people want to talk about this, we can talk about it. According to the evidence in recent Justice Department voting suits, vouching and other tests is the principal method used to bar Black people from polls. Discriminatory administration of voting qualifications has been found in all 8 Alabama cases, all 9 Louisiana cases, et cetera, et cetera. Blacks have typically been required to pass difficult versions of all the tests without any outside assistance and without the slightest error. The quote, good morals requirement, and I'm reading from text, so these aren't my words. Good morals requirement is so vague and subjective that it has constituted an open invitation to abuse at the hands of voting officials. Black people are obliged to obtain vouchers from registered voters, and they have found it virtually impossible to do so in areas where almost no Black voters are on the voter registration rolls. Now, does anyone know the radical text from which I am reading about vouching? Any lawyers in the crowd?
I'd say it
Anyone want
sounds
to
like
guess
a
the year?
Supreme Court opinion, but I don't know.
Yeah, it is a Supreme Court opinion. From when? Anyone want to guess?
Long time ago.
1966. 1966. 1966. That is Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1966. Because vouching, having white voters vouch for Black people so that Black people could be able, and I had to change other language in here as I was reading it, but this was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court. So vouching and having white people vouch for Black people as a mode of access is very, very old, and it's a well-trodden systemic problem. And so that's an issue with 506C and the use of prove to me that you have this wealth. So Mac, the fact that you were able to raise those dollars and the fact that you knew you had a number limit on the investors you could bring in also means that you had to optimize for bigger checks, among other things, right? And so it's a skewed system, and there are ways that we can be helpful in navigating, that we as a community can be helpful in navigating the system. And I want to talk about access to capital when you don't have that network. And Eric, you didn't necessarily grow up in that network, and you didn't go to the schools that most VCs went to. What do you think enabled you, growing up in Texas, to access that broader network and become part of the kind of senior class in venture?
Good question. I mean, tons of just luck and fortune along the way, but there's part of me that is optimistic about tech being an equalizer of many things. And the trend lines, we're not there yet, but the trend lines are encouraging and pointing in the right direction. I always like to talk about in fact, I call it tech prosperity. We're all prosperity is defined as sort of the value or output that you get from the input or work that you put into it. And tech is making us all more prosperous. I was reading this book called The Rational Optimist a few years ago, and they said that, I think 200 years ago, if you worked an hour, generally, an average person working an hour, they would generate enough wealth to be able to buy 15 minutes of light. So enough energy, or they could purchase enough energy to generate 15 minutes of light, because it was, oils and candles and stuff. But today you work an hour, an average person, you generate enough wealth to buy a full year's worth of light, because electricity is a lot cheaper. And that's a tech innovation that's happened. It's making us all prosperous. And on the entrepreneur side, on the startup side, I see it as well, where 20, 30 years ago, you would have to raise a lot of capital and hire a lot of people to build any product, because tech was really hard to do. And therefore the gatekeepers had much more influence and control over that. But fast forward today, even like the Instagram story, they got that thing going off of running, AWS bills on a credit card. You see more and more of that. And that's just going to open up the doors for more people that have an idea, they have something to say, they have something they want to put out in the world. The gatekeepers are no longer a necessity to make that happen. And I saw this other great chart that actually a fund that I sent, that I'm an investor in, sent out, and talked about like the areas that they are focusing on. And right now it's a very challenging, very, very competitive time for investing. So, if it's they identified if it's an unknown founder with no product market fit, that's kind of the area that's still open that they can go and dive into. But in that same chart, they said that if it's an unknown founder with product market fit, crazy scrum, incredibly competitive, it doesn't matter. So because tech is opening up these opportunities for everyone to be able to access and build, you have a shot at getting something that has traction, that has demonstrated success. And once you do that, for better or for worse, people become colorblind. Everyone wants to back the next success case. They just, it doesn't matter what ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation the team or founder is. If you've got 40% D30 retention, like you're getting a check. And again, before to get to that point, there were gatekeepers, but I am optimistic that as these trends continue to evolve, getting to that point is going to be democratized to anyone. And I think as a minority in this space, the best thing that we can get is a chance. It's all we're asking for, is a chance. And I do see tech opening up more chances for everyone, which is encouraging.
Laura, what does that face mean?
Yes, and this is probably my my generous reaction. I think there's like fundamental aspects of what you're saying that is right. Like there's greater the barriers to a lot of things that are required to start companies, to build products, to get seen, are dropping. And there are still like numerous systemic barriers that disproportionately affect some groups. Like what came to mind when you said the Instagram founders got Instagram up and running on a credit card, like that could never have happened before. That is incredible. And when I started Code 2040, first of all, I had to use my own credit to get a credit card for the organization. And I was very fortunate to have credit because my mother got me a credit card when I was 15 that she paid off. The very few things I was allowed to buy, she paid off so that I would have credit by the time I was in my 20s, and I could open a credit card to start a company. Not what she envisioned, but what I use it for. Um, and I had a young Black woman who was on my team, and this was actually what spurred me to get a company credit card. Is we needed to undertake an expense. She had to book a flight somewhere, and she didn't have enough credit on her credit card to book that flight. She would not have been able to buy anything else that month based on the credit card company extended to her. And thankfully, she felt comfortable sharing that with me, so that her manager had asked her to book that flight, and she was like, I can't. And she felt comfortable sharing that, and so we were able to handle that. But like the ability to have credit, the availability of credit, like all of that is still very skewed based on racial lines in particular. And so I think a lot of I mean, this is why I feel like it's a yes and, like, yes, all these barriers are dropping, and there's still a number of like cross-cutting barriers that that differentiate who's able to really participate in this segment of the economy. And you know, when the comment about like, you know, if you have XYZ traction, like it doesn't matter what background you're getting a check. I think that's also true to a degree, but there's also like pattern matching is real, and there's certain types of traction that are like super recognizable to folks, and then there's other types of traction or potential that are really not. And I don't know if like Mac and Ed, if there's a version of the story of what happened in our prep call that feels like could be shared, but that's what came to mind for
Can
me.
I jump in? Because this is a great segue to like my favorite story, which is my North Star story, right? I know Ed knows this story really well. So sorry, Ed, you probably heard the story like 20 times at this point. And for those who follow me on Twitter or been to any of my other talks, you've heard the story before, but like this is a really important story. It's the reason why I decided to start a fund instead of going making real money at a big time firm and like getting all that kind of recognition, right? No, I decided to start a little tiny fund where I could barely pay myself because of issues like this. And so when I was working for the state of Maryland, one of the things I did 4 months into my job working for the investment arm of the state was I gave my bosses a proposal for a pre-seed fund to invest in originally Black founders earlier than anybody else, really trying to institutionalize the friends and family round to help grow our pipeline of Black founders who could get to our seed fund. Ran that for 3.5 years, ended up being the first and only state-backed pre-seed fund for women and minorities in the country. Something I'm very proud of. It's now a line item in the state's budget. There's $1 million, that number's increasing. That's awesome. I thought that was going to be one of the greatest things I ever did. But when I was starting that fund, I met this Black woman out of Baltimore who told me she had an amazing idea. I was like, great, you and everybody else, but tell me your great idea. And she proceeds to tell me that she wants to create a tumble dryer that will dry a wig or hair extension in 15 minutes with no heat. One of the most original ideas I'd ever heard, but I didn't know much about wigs. Started looking into it, come to find out, a lot of the women I knew who got wigs just washed them and hung up to dry overnight. Just inefficient. Then I started talking to professional stylists and had them telling me the exact same thing. I had stylists showing me the racks in their shop that they use to hang hair to dry overnight. And I'm like, yo, this is crazy. Like, this is clearly like 2017, we can do better. And so I started to help this woman. I'm mentoring her, making introductions, trying to help her find some money. And nobody cared, not even my organization. She was too early. She didn't have a prototype. People didn't believe in the market. Come to find out, the wig and hair extension market is a $6 billion market, projected to grow to be a $10 billion market. But in actuality, it's probably much larger than that because we don't collect good data on it, because data on stuff that Black people tend to spend money on is not usually all the best. So we'll start there. And then this woman bought a small dryer off Amazon, took out the heating components and reconfigured it to prove out the concept could work. Of course she did. She's got an engineering degree from Morgan State, a master's from Johns Hopkins, and at the time was a patent examiner. She was a builder, y'all. That's what she does. She builds stuff. Nobody cared. She got nothing but no's for 3 years. literally because she didn't come from a place where she could get access to capital to just start to build a prototype. And so after 3 years of watching her get nothing but no's, she gives me a call one day. She's all excited. She's like, Mac, I figured out how to pay for my prototype. She's all happy, and I'm happy too, because, you know, somehow somebody must have gave her some money. She won a pitch competition, something. But then I was a little skeptical because, you know, founders do crazy things. Oh, sell your car, mortgage a home to like pay to get things built, right? No, this woman became a surrogate mother. She gave birth to twins for 40 grand just so she could start building her prototype. And I got frustrated. I couldn't think of a firm that I could have worked at and made that investment. And, you know, honestly, the fact that she decided that becoming a surrogate mother was the only way she could get access to capital is heartbreaking. But then let's take a capitalist standpoint, right? Like me as a venture capitalist, VCs, we all say we want to invest in category defining companies. Here's a woman literally building a product in an industry that hadn't had innovation in our lifetime. With 7 equally as innovative products she wants to bring to market. And nobody could see the opportunity in that. There was nowhere for her to go. Purely because of who she was, what she looked like, and what school she went to. Yeah, she got a master's from Johns Hopkins, but that's for bio. That's not like a VC hub, right? And so I literally quit my job and raised a $10 million fund so I could give her a $250,000 check so she could start building her first prototype. The name of the company is Meet Spundle. It's spundle.com. So meetspundle.com, I'll put it in the chat. The woman's name is Shauna Stepp Jones. She is my hero. But like, yes, it is easier than ever before to build a company. But that doesn't mean it's easy. Easier doesn't mean easy. It's still hard. Still very, very, very hard.
I feel like I can't say anything after that story. That was
Very inspiring.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah. And it feels like intentional silence is appropriate right after that. And Kalani, who has been dropping stuff in the chat, that's amazing, is someone worth following, founder of Black Tech Nation Ventures, in which we're proud investors, and a Code 2040 alum up in Pittsburgh. And she is also spotlighting, I believe it's pronounced Kaitsa, because Kaitsa dropped a great question, which is, how do you know, the wealth gap is connected to systems that empowered some and hindered others. And we're talking about access to capital, and how do you make up for the generations of people not being able to own a home, or the credit system that rewards those with homes, and how do we switch the narrative? And so it would be useful to talk about how to think about raising funds where you don't have to do those kind of extraordinary things, and where you can overcome the extraordinary systemic barriers. And I also want to give people an opportunity to respond directly to Mac's North Star story, because it's an unbelievable story, and we're all rooting for her and rooting for Mac. I mean, I'm particularly rooting for Mac because I'm an investor in the fund, but we're all rooting for Mac.
I need all the rooting I can get, y'all. Yeah. I mean, I watched what that woman went through to go through that, right? And like the excitement she had, just the idea that she could get money and start moving her product forward. And yet the extreme she had to go. And still nobody wanted to back her. Like, even after all that, like, that's incredible, right? And granted, today, you know, as I tell that story, people are like, yeah, that makes sense. And now she's got people who want to support her and people who want to get behind the story. But it literally took me screaming from the hilltops, pay attention. You know, it's kind of like the scene at the end of Spike Lee's movie, where where they're just yelling, wake up. Like I'm just yelling at everybody, like, wake up. Like, please just wake up. But I'm one person, right? And that's why it's so important for all of us to be mindful of these things as we create our funds. Like, am I always going to invest pre-product, pre-revenue in a company? No, it rarely happens. But when you see something extraordinary like that, you do it, right? And you have to have the conviction to do it. I recently had a very prominent VC tell me that another company in the same industry, that industry was fundamentally something they weren't interested in and didn't believe could create billion-dollar companies. And this is somebody of like real importance in the venture ecosystem. I couldn't believe it. I mean, I could, like, I was disappointed. I wasn't shocked, right? And so yes, we're talking about all the ways this industry is changing and how we're fixing it, but still a process. It's still a process.
How is her company doing today?
Her company's doing well today. She's gotten the money from me. She's with a design firm out of Memphis, Tennessee, who is helping her build out the prototype. Her first version of her prototype should be ready by the middle of this year. And I am starting to surround her with a marketing and PR team to do a really large Kickstarter campaign. Cause I just want to shout in everybody's faces who like passed and didn't pay attention to this, like, check this out. So she's moving, but she can always use more help. So if anybody wants to reach out to me so you can help her, get in touch with her, or get in touch with me, like, please do.
That's fantastic.
I think there is cause for optimism and the number. I wish now, Ed, I'm like, gosh, I got to memorize more stats so I can live up to the reputation Ed has set for me. But the amount of venture capital, both the amount of money and the number of funds, has just absolutely exploded recently. And so there are more people writing checks from more different backgrounds, which is encouraging. We are at the beginning, I think, of seeing a shift, certainly in terms of who controls the dollars. If you look at that, it is less encouraging, but we're at the beginning. But I think part of what this conversation highlights is there are individual actors and then there are systemic challenges, and like those two things interplay and they're both important. But there's only so much I think individual actors can do within the systemic challenges that are against them. And maybe if I can do like a little bit of a plug for kind of the way Base 10 has structured the advancement initiative, because I think this is a good highlight of like we both need individuals like Mac who are kind of bringing a different perspective, who are showing there's a different way to raise money, a different way to deploy money. And the reason that I joined Base 10 was the way that they designed the advancement initiative, which was basically, asking and answering the question, like, is there a way that we can use venture capital for wealth redistribution, not wealth aggregation? And the advancement initiative is a growth fund. It's about a $250 million fund. And a lot of the sort of movement in venture has been about who writes the checks and who gets the capital. And that's extremely important. But it's actually not what the advancement initiative is focused on at all. The companies that are in our portfolio are just the sort of category defining top tech companies: Notion, Figma, FTX, companies that are kind of path to IPO. And the innovation in the advancement initiative is actually who is on the cap table, who the LPs are. And there's a number of things that we've done at Base 10 to remove the systemic barriers for historically Black colleges and universities to participate in venture. It's not an accident or a coincidence that HBCUs haven't had access to this asset class. And back to that Harvard stat that I shared, the 11 billion that they added to their endowment last year, that was driven by 77% returns in their venture and PE portfolio. And so this is the classic, like, takes money to make money. Harvard has the luxury of being able to put a whole bunch of capital in a illiquid and relatively risky asset class. And if you're an HBCU with a very small endowment, you can't tie up your money for 7 to 10 years to get a return. You can't take a risk with that amount of your capital. You can't afford the fees. There's sort of and you probably don't know or have, like, you don't have full-time investment professionals managing your endowment when it's quite small, the way Harvard has, and Ivies have an entire team of folks who are managing their endowment. And so Base 10 structured the advancement initiative so that we do outreach to HBCUs. We don't charge fees. There's no minimum investment. It's a growth fund so that the time to liquidity is shortened. And Base 10 as a firm donates half of our profits to the HBCUs, so that it's the risk profile and the time to liquidity profile of a growth fund, but it is the return profile targeting of an early stage fund. And then we have a bunch of mission aligned investors who are LPs in the fund as well to sort of round it out, because we can't raise an entire growth fund from HBCUs at this point. There isn't enough capital to deploy in that way. And the reason that we have chosen to work with HBCUs is back to what I mentioned about a third of HBCU students are below the poverty line when they enter. HBCUs are the leading graduate of Black STEM degrees. Howard University produces more Black PhDs than the Ivy League combined every year. So these are like engines of Black education and Black economic mobility, but without the capital to do a bunch of the wraparound things that mean they can engage their alumni association, they can provide financial aid, they can have robust career services and connections into the industry. They don't have the capital for that. All of their capital is like deployed against the sort of basic education. And so the idea is that by growing the endowments of these institutions, we can actually change the calculus for the students that are moving through and provide like new entree into the innovation economy and the tech sector for the students, but also the ability for the HBCUs to sort of self-determine and deploy this capital in the ways that they see are best in meeting their missions. And so my hope is that as we move forward, we see innovation in not just how we raise funds and who's writing the checks, and thus more inclusion and who's receiving checks, but also like a better understanding of how this asset class, which is making some people exceptionally wealthy, could actually be a tool to like redistribute and uplift communities more broadly, as opposed to just kind of this closed circle of wealth generation.
And I want to also underscore the work that Goldhouse is doing, because one of the uncomfortable conversations, and it's important to talk about the uncomfortable conversations that we've been having, is around pools of funding for underrepresented founders and pools of funding for underrepresented investors. And when we talk about that, there is this unsettling conversation about the extent to which the Asian community or the API community is included in that, and the extent to which there is a force to make people of color fight for a fixed pool of crumbs from the table. And one of the things that we've seen in the stats, and Laura, you mentioned that there are more underrepresented folks in venture now. There's a stat that the number of Black VCs, senior VCs, increased from 4% to 5% of the pool of senior VCs in America year over year. At the same time, the number of Latinx senior VCs decreased from 4% to 3%. And it's literally, I mean, both those numbers, I'm only a lawyer, but both those numbers add up to 8, right? And it's literally like the venture world said, you get 8 out of 100 chairs, you figure out which of you gets to sit in them. In fact, we'd love it if you guys fought over that. Just keep us out of it. And we have to expand the seats at the table. And we have to talk about as well the discriminatory practices toward the API community, the acrimony toward the API community. And we can't shortchange the conversation about HBCUs. So I'm going to tell you one thing about how the Advancement Initiative Fund has impacted me personally. And then I want Eric to talk a little bit about Goldhouse and some of the other work that is being done in other parts of Goldhouse. So Betsy and I invested in First Close Partners, which we co-founded with a number of friends. And Eric is an investor in First Close, and we're very appreciative. And Base 10 and Rare Breed are part of our portfolio. I'm hopeful that Goldhouse will be as well. We love what Base 10 is doing and love the Advancement Initiative. Separately, as I mentioned, I sit on the board of Fisk, which is this amazing HBCU in Nashville. And I know that it's incredibly generous of Base 10 to say that some of the carry will be ratably distributed, right? Some of the profits of the fund will be ratably distributed to HBCUs that invest in the fund, and the HBCUs don't have to pay a management fee. Well, Fisk, which is this historic institution, Representative John Lewis, U.S. Rep. John Lewis went to Fisk, among others, and Fisk doesn't have the funding to participate. So through the kindness of your partners, Jameson and Ade and others there, Betsy and I initiated a series of calls, and Betsy and I wrote a $100,000 check, and you folks gave us a $100,000 allocation, and we gave it immediately to Fisk, and Fisk is now a participating HBCU. They are now an LP in your fund. Teresa Gao with her ACRU DCF fund wrote $1 million check and gave them $1 million allocation. And so Fisk is now an LP in 2 extraordinary venture funds, and they are values aligned. And I mean, I had to write a check to Fisk anyway, because I'm a member of the board. And I'm saying this not to sort of boast about, I'm saying it because I want others to do this. There are creative ways to create LPs. There are creative ways to change the dynamic. And for me, it's not charity. So I'm going to do something I don't do, which is share, and I've never done this, but I'm going to publicly share some of my own personal investing stats. So Betsy and I have been investing in venture funds, and this is part of why we did First Close Partners, to invest in venture funds owned and operated by underrepresented VCs. So because I am the longest tenured lawyer at any startup lawyer at any law firm in New York, I've had extraordinary opportunities. And once I paid off my massive student debt, Beth started investing. And from 2012 to 2018, 21 of the venture capital funds that Betsy and I had invested in were underrepresented led. And we use the definition as 50% or more by both headcount and economics of the partners are underrepresented. Okay, which I think is a more stringent lens than most are using. When we aggregated our return on those funds and we compared it each year to the Cambridge benchmarks for both all US VC funds and separately all US early stage VC funds. We outperformed, we performed well into the top quartile. So if Betsy and I were VCs directly investing, the returns we've made just on the almost 24 venture funds we backed from 2012 to 2018 that were 50% or more owned by underrepresented VCs, the aggregate return would have been well into the top quartile of all venture funds in the US and of all early stage venture funds in the US for a period during which venture funds outperformed historical benchmarks generally. Underrepresented and overperforming, underrepresented and overperforming, and working harder to perform. And that's part of our thesis. It's part of why we're doing first close partners. And it's part of why the data actually is important. And I didn't know in 2012, when we started writing these checks, I didn't know that they would, that we would together have a pool of basically top quartile performance just by investing in people who were largely overlooked by the venture markets. But it's extraordinary to do the right thing and make real money doing it. And we have to make sure that that wealth creation opportunity is spread. So Eric, do you want to talk a little bit about what you're doing with Goldhouse? And Laura, thank you and your colleagues for the amazing work that you're doing, the amazing writing that you've done on HBCUs, the awareness, the investing. You're changing the game. All three of you are changing the game.
Yes, standing ovation for Mac and Laura for the great work they're doing. On the Goldhouse side, it's been a interesting last couple of years. In fact, I remember a conversation I had with you, Ed, where we were discussing Goldhouse Ventures and First Close, and you said, "Hey, we should chat," and I was like, "Wait, does Asian count as underrepresented?" Like, I assume it didn't, and that's sort of the conversations I have with people. It's just like I go in assuming it doesn't count, if there's any sort of thing that be encouraged by over the last few years is that some of the changes in our community, in the API community, have rallied us together to think more about ourselves as a unique ethnicity and culture that should work together to stand up for our rights and what we believe in, and also to ask for more representation. And I think that's a great thing, because one of the challenges of the Asian community is just how fragmented we are. While I feel very fortunate as an East Asian to have been given lots of opportunities for social and economic advancements in this country. There are Southeast Asians from Vietnam and Cambodia, Laos, and the Philippines that, if you look at per capita, they are amongst the highest individuals in this country per capita that live below the poverty line. So you have this incredibly broad range of what it means to be Asian, and I think that's been one of the challenges of our community. But at Goldhouse, there's lots of different ways to address this challenge, and the tactic that Goldhouse has taken is around representation at the very top. We sort of practice this trickle down effect of if there can be success at the top, then that's the way you change the game. If you succeed in the spotlight, that's the way you change the game. You could subsidize, maybe like lower income people, or work with education. There's lots of great positive things to do, but the tactic of Goldhouse is really about trying to promote representation. So, without crazy rich Asians, there's no Shang-Chi, and without Shang-Chi's, there's no discussion of folks like Henry Golding as maybe the next Bond, which would be amazing. But it's really this representation at the highest levels is what we think can be game changing. Which is also, I'm so excited, Laura, that you're talking about getting into some of the most blue chip marquee investment assets possible to deliver great returns for your LPs. That's because you kind of get one shot in terms of getting them interested, but if the fund doesn't put up numbers, if it doesn't return, then we're sort of back to square one. So it's about the success. And same with you, Mac. Like, that's why I asked that question about how your entrepreneur is doing. Like you've done the hard work of that first step of getting her a chance, which is amazing. But I want that company to be a unicorn. I want that company to go public. I want that company to be all over CNBC, because that's how this game changes. So I fundamentally do believe in this collective mission of not only opening up access to opportunities, but the entrepreneurs that walk through have to be successful, or else we're sort of just back at square one. So I think that's going to be the next challenge for all of us over the next few years is to help and support and find these examples of success and shine the brightest possible spotlight on them, so that everyone around the world can be inspired by it, and also the traditional gatekeepers can understand that this is actually good business to back more diverse talent. I remember back in my sort of traditional venture days, there was a company called We. They do online grocery delivery, and I remember talking to a number of investors about it. And they do online grocery delivery of Chinese groceries for ethnic groceries. It's like a Ranch 99 meet Instacart online. And if you covered up the logo and you looked in the category and you looked at the metrics at the early stage of the Series A, they were really positive and very strong. But the second you took your name off the logo and you saw the category, every investor walked away, because they were just like, this is not a big category. It's not a big business. Sorry, it's a very niche company. And last year they raised hundreds of millions of dollars from some very prominent investors and broke through. But what was so exciting about that is, again, the fact that it is they're succeeding in the spotlight. They're exceeding in public, and now you have investor conversations. And at Gold House Ventures, we invested in another similar company in the space called Umami Cart that was able to raise a seed round and was able to raise some institutional capital, because people are looking for the next we. And again, that doesn't happen if we is not successful. To just back in the same spot about covering up that logo, and these companies not getting a chance. So that's why we just fundamentally believe at Gold House that representation is going to be a really important strategy of making real change.
I want to jump in here, Ed, real quick. I saw Tracy put something in the chat about, stop asking for a seat at the table. We need to build our own damn table, right? And I love that sentiment. Let's be honest about this, right? Venture and what we do is a very tiny piece of private equity, right? Private equity is where the big money is. And where does private equity and venture get our money? We get it from institutional investors. That's where the actual money and power is. The endowments, the large fund of funds, some of these hedge funds, that's where the real money is, right? That's the industry. And we keep talking about we want to change the industry. Well, let's talk about the top of this power structure. Folks like me raised funds in 2020 and 2021 on the backs of the killing of George Floyd. After George Floyd's murder, there were all these initiatives that came out. Well, here's the problem. I got a bunch of money from some of those initiatives. So did my peers. And you know what those initiatives told us once they were finished deploying the capital? We're done. There was no re-up. It was a one-time thing, because initiatives are usually time-based. Well, now let's take a roll back, right? After George Floyd, we saw all these articles and all these people come out and talk about wanting to support Black founders, founders of color, underrepresented founders. We talked about fighting against Asian hate. All that came out. And all these people made, these declaration statements that they were going to give money. You saw all these corporations say they were going to give money. All these venture funds say they were going to give money. But here's the most telling thing about that time period. Guess who didn't? All the institutional LPs that I just talked about who are at the top of the power structure. They didn't say anything. One, because you don't know who they are, and two, because they don't have to. Because they don't have to care. Because you know what? If they never did this, if they never invested in an underrepresented founder, it wouldn't matter, because they're still making money. And so to Eric's point, what's most important? If we don't have companies that we can shine a light on to show they're going to be successful, they can keep discrediting us. Like Think about it. You say we want to make our own table. They have the money. Like, how are you going to make a table when they hold the wood? Right? You're going to try to make it. We're over here trying to make a table with dirt. Say we're going to sit it on. No, that's the power structure. And they said nothing. People ask me all the time, Mac, rare breed, why don't you have a diversity mandate? Why don't you only invest in underrepresented founders? Well, one, I'm a capitalist, just generally speaking. I like investing in the best and brightest, whoever it is. But two, I want to have a large institution one day. I want to raise $1 billion fund one day. And when I get in front of these institutional investors, the moment I start talking about diversity, they start to drone out, or they start to think small. I literally didn't add that to my fund model, to my fund mandate, because I just didn't need the extra barrier. I'm just going to show you a bunch of logos of companies being successful. If it just so happens that 77% of the founders in my portfolio are underrepresented, cool. I don't have to say it. I don't have to talk about it. All I have to talk about is the numbers. And then after the fact, I'm going to put the brightest light possible on all those founders that are doing such amazing work, that look away that they didn't realize. They're going to invest in my fund one day and not even realize they're investing in funds that got a bunch of diverse founders in it. And then when they find out, guess what they're going to do? They're going to tout it and say, look at all the diverse founders we helped back, right? Retroactively. But that is still the system. Like, no matter how I want to go about it, like, there are still some rules I got to follow. And so shout out to Backstage, shout out to Harlem Capital, shout out to Collab, shout out to, Lightship Capital, all these folks who do have those mandates. Because that's just a harder road to go. I literally was trying to take the path of least resistance. But how terrible is that?
It reminds me of something my old client partner, Beth Seidenberg, used to say. She ran our life sciences practice and just phenomenal investor. But she used to always tell our LPs that, look, first and foremost, I plan to make you a lot of money. Secondly, you're going to feel really good about it in the process because, we'll be helping cure cancer and creating new therapeutics and diagnostics, and we'll be saving lives. But first and foremost, I'm going to make you a lot of money. And I think that was just absolutely the right strategy here, in that, success is how we can change the game. But there's many ways that we can define success. We don't have to define it in the traditional way. We can define it in these categories that are massive business opportunities that just historically have not been focused in on. We can define it with entrepreneurs that don't look like the examples of success from previous generations. But at the end of the day, got to have success.
So to Mac's comments, with which I agree, this is part of why we did First Close Partners as a fund to invest in underrepresented managers. And it's also why I'm sharing stats from the underrepresented managers Betsy and I were backing from 2012 to 2018. We've been writing the checks, we've been getting the money back, and then some. And when we looked at our broader portfolio of the more than 100 venture funds in which we had invested from 2011 to 2020, the vast majority of our entering points were GPs at those funds who themselves were underrepresented. So there's a really successful Kleiner Perkins fund that I invested in because my friend Eric gave me an allocation in Kleiner Perkins. And when I look at the returns I made investing in Accel's venture funds, which are amazing, it's because my friend Teresa Gao gave me an allocation in Accel. And that network is enormously valuable. And for First Close, our LP base includes 50 VCs, 11 of them on the Midas list with more than 60 rankings in the last decade alone. And our LP base is itself majority underrepresented, which was something that was really important for us. And for many of them, it's their first investment in the asset class. And the LP asset class does have to change. The LP base does have to change. And we can have impact and make money at the same time. But these comments are, very much are very much on point. I will also share with you, and I see Danielle Carr from our Lowenstein team, who is our senior exec in charge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and who does an extraordinary job and is an inspiring leader. We track our own stats, and I have not shared these publicly either, but for me personally, when I'm working at Lowenstein on a deal for last year, I know that for every hour, those were for every hour that my team worked on my stuff, a majority of those hours were worked by women on our team, and just over a third of those hours were worked by people of color on our team. And for the summer of last year through Halloween of last year, I know that our team was majority female, and a third of our team were people of color. I think those numbers have gone up because I also know that 70% of our hires in that period were not white males. 35% of our hires are of color in that period, and 53% are women. And I think it's important to understand the people, the data from the people with whom you're working, and to ask for data from the people with whom you're working or the people that you're backing. I'm not saying that these are perfect numbers. I would certainly put them up against anyone in our industry who's doing this at scale, for sure. But I think it's important to be accountable to the numbers and to find ways to make sure that you're creating opportunity. And if you listen to Laura's talks, and there are a bunch from 2016 in particular that go into real detail on how to be more inclusive and equitable in your hiring practice. And if you follow experts like Danielle Carr and others, there's a lot of learning there. So Laura and Mac, if you want to have the last words here as we close out, fire away.
I just realized I was drinking out of my mug that says, I've got 99 problems and white heteronormative patriarchy is basically all of them. It's just systems change. That's the space that I play in. But no, thank you for this conversation. I think it's all of these different efforts and initiatives are required, whether it's individual action or starting things like Gold House or backing these sorts of entrepreneurs. It's all, my hope is that we can all be thinking this way, because that is absolutely what's required to create change in any version of our lifetimes or those of our children.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I said some of the quiet things out loud, so you'll have to excuse me. I just want everybody to remember, when we talk about diversity, very often I feel like that word gets co-opted for us to be talking about our own social interest groups, right? If we're going to talk about diversity, let's say what that means. That means everybody, right? Even in my fund, I think about that, right? There are certain things that there are certain ethnic groups and demographics we do really well with, and some we don't, right? And if we want to be a champion of diversity, then we need to be that. Now, if you want to be a champion of your own interest group, say that. Don't use diversity to talk about women. Don't use diversity to talk about Black women. Don't use diversity to talk about Black. Don't use diversity to talk about BIPOC, right? Diversity means everybody. So when we talk about we want to be diverse or have diverse workforce, diverse cultures, diverse venture ecosystems, that means we need to have open arms for everybody and not be fighting against each other, or defending against each other, say, hey, there's enough white men here already. We don't need any more. Like, that's not necessarily true, right? So I just want everybody, as they think about that word diversity, what does it actually mean versus how people are using it, right? I'm here to see a diverse community grow. If you look at my Twitter and all the people following me on Twitter, I call them my community. And it spans everybody, even folks who have in their bio that they're Trump supporters. And I want to block every single one of them, but I don't, because their perspective matters. Their ideas matter. Them as people matter, right? And maybe them being part of my Twitter community, they might see some other sides and other things they wouldn't have seen before. And so as we think about how do we do all this and make this a better ecosystem, let's just all work together.
And Eric, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add. Laura, love the mug. I've been, and this is on point to Eric's comment, this is our Green Cow Ventures mug. Green Cow is a fund that we invested in underrepresented founders, both of them. And it is the first fund in the first closed portfolio that returned more than the entire fund. And they did it in less than a year from our investment, because they had an AI robotics exit that was massive. And I am also wearing my Site Black Women t-shirt, which I tweeted about before the event. And I encourage you to look into what that movement is all about. And before Eric gets the last word, I want to thank Cotron, Brian Weisgall, and Kelsey Repka on my team for doing research on our speakers today, which is greatly appreciated. And I also want to thank the incredible VentureCrush team at Lowenstein, Katie and Brittany and Carrie and Angela and Betty, and Jenny, Carolyn, who put all of this stuff together and invite the community in. So Eric, how would you like to close out today?
I'll just close out by thanking the one person who hasn't been thanked properly yet, which is you, Ed. Really appreciate you bringing us all together, convening this opportunity for us all to share insightful thoughts. It was a fantastic conversation, and just, I learned so much just getting to listen to Mac and Laura share their insights and perspectives. And these things don't happen if you don't put them together. So again, Ed, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. All right. Thanks so much, everyone.